You are listening to the Visualizing War and Peace podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined armed conflict in different periods or places. And we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Albert Surinach I Campos, a student researcher at the Visualizing Peace VIP project at St. Andrews University, led by Dr. Alice Koenig.
Today we're here to talk about Tolkien, the role of peace within his hugely influential works, and whether the messages found in The Lord of the Rings are ultimately pacifist or not. To discuss these topics, we have with us Dr. Giuseppe Pezzini. Dr. Giuseppe Pezzini is a fellow and tutor of the Corpus Christi College in Oxford University. He is a professor of Latin language and literature, and he has a master's degree and doctorate in classics. Besides the study of classics, he is also involved in the study of Tolkien, being a Tolkien editor for the Journal of Inklings Studies and having published a number of extremely interesting articles on the connections between Tolkien's works and classical literature. Dr. Pezzini, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Just as an introduction, we'll remind some of the audience a little bit about Tolkien, his works. Now, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote some of the most influential books of the 20th and 21st century. He's considered the father of fantasy. The Lord of the Rings is the third most sold novel of all time. And there will be few listeners, honestly, that are not familiar with either some of his books or the movie adaptations. So he has a really important role in our society as a cultural influence. And today we want to examine the role of peace in Tolkien's work. The so-called Tolkien's Legendarium encompasses all of his books. We have the main ones are The Lord of the Rings, that we're going to discuss here the most, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion. And in order to do so, we will engage in intertextuality with other sources to determine connections and archetypes from other literature. However, before we begin, it's important to remind the audience that the active dislike that Tolkien had toward anyone trying to pry the inspirations of The Lord of the Rings, right? So there's a lot of quotes from him basically saying, be satisfied with the soup and not with the bones of the ox from which it was made. So it's always something to be mindful of, and it's maybe more important on just seeing the connections and intertextuality rather than the actual sources. And throughout this interview, we'll focus on considering the four main races found in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien in order to explore just different aspects of humanity that he embodied in each, and therefore the respective perceptions of war and peace.
Fantastic. Looking forward to it.
So the first question is about the elves and the decline of the world. Because when examining the Lord of Tolkien's worldview, one of the issues that immediately surfaces is a nostalgic, declinist view of the world that is constantly diminishing. You have a glorious, a golden age at the beginning, and then the successive eras of mortals that slowly dwindle and are broken apart. Now, here we can see a very clear parallel with the golden age of antiquity, as well as with other mythologies around the world. In your research, Dr. Pezzini, you talk about how elves are a group that represents this concept the best, how they could almost be seen as Romans and Greeks, Romans and Greeks of Tolkien's world. Drawing comparisons with other mythologies, how pessimistic do you think Tolkien's outlook on the future and the attainment of that peace is based on the presence of the elves?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, in order to answer to this question, I will make a first important distinction, just because we're coming back on this distinction later, maybe in the conversation, and it's the distinction between a primary and a secondary outlook, using Tolkien's terminology. And according to Tolkien, there are different planes to consider. There is one plane which he calls the primary plane, the real plane, and we may say the biographical plane. So Tolkien, we should address the question that you posed from the point of view of Tolkien's own life. What kind of man Tolkien was, what were the events that he encountered, and as he says in the letter again and again, he was a man who fought or suffered in two wars. Most of his life was dominated by the war, First World War and the Second World War, and also was marked by a great as he calls it, a great destruction, a great experience of loss. And that's the loss of people who were born, as he says, in the late 19th century, in the Belle Époque, a sort of golden age of the modern world, where everything seemed to go very well, and then suddenly everything was kind of taken away. And in his own particular life, it was a kind of a generational loss, together with other hundreds of thousands of people who died at the Somme or were traumatized during the First World War, but also it was a personal loss because he lost his father and then his mother and then some of his best friends by the age of 25. Okay, so this is he's a man who experienced loss and decline more than any other people. And then if there was not enough, then the Second World War came, and there was again another very traumatic experience for him. He was not fighting directly, but his sons were, and he followed very closely that. And also we should remember that the Lord of the Rings was written during the Second World War, and in many respects certainly is not an allegory of the Second World War, and they don't even think that he represents a picture of the Second World War, because I think that in terms of the imagination, the First World War is more relevant to the Lord of the Rings, and yet kind of the feelings, the emotions are rooted in that someone was going to the Second World War. So that's, if you want, the primary plane. And how pessimistic Tolkien was in the primary sense, certainly was pessimistic, but not only pessimistic. And that's his personality was very complex. He was a complex personality of a man who was certainly, in a sense, depressed. There is a very beautiful letter written by one of his best friends, who is called Robert Murray, who was the grandson of James Murray, the great man of the OED, and he said in a letter that was published just a few years ago that Tolkien was a very depressed man. And I would agree with that. I mean, in many respects, he was depressed, but he was depressed also because he did really suffer horrible traumas during the First World War. But it was not just that. I mean, that's the beauty of Tolkien's personality. Tolkien was not just pessimistic. Together with this, there was a more sense of hope, of optimism, the glimpses of a final victory, as he says in a letter. And I think the two things come together. So he was a man with different aspects of his personality. And I think any attempt to reduce his personality in the primary sense to a single view is problematic. So he was pessimistic, but not just pessimistic. Addressing now the question from the secondary sense, in the secondary way, that is to say within the secondary world, I think we can say the same thing. I mean, the secondary world of Tolkien is a complex world. It's a world which does not express only one worldview. There are many different worldviews expressed, and of course the one of the elves is an important worldview, also because most of his works, apart from the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits, are focalized through the elves. That is to say, they are presented as tales of the elves and written by elves from the point of view of the elves. That's what the Silmarillion is about. That's something that Tolkien says again and again. And certainly the outlook of the Silmarillion in particular is very pessimistic, is very negative, is very declinist. There is this perception of things going worse, and more specifically going worse in terms of peace. There is in the Silmarillion less peace the more we go on. So there is essentially a series of battles, and the war gets worse and worse and worse as things proceed, and also the hope of victory against evil, against Morgoth, gets thinner and thinner and thinner. When we get to the Lord of the Rings, we still have this position expressed, especially in two places, in Rivendell, one, and Lorien, the other, which in a sense represent the two strongholds of the Elvish position in the world. Different, not exactly the same, but similar, and both of them are presented as places of peace. Especially Lorien, I quote, is presented in a letter as an enchanted enclave of peace. That's what Lorien is, and also what Rivendell is. So the position of the elves is strongly also related to the issue of war, in the sense that what the elves try to do is to create places where we have peace to defend themselves against the war outside. And this, of course, is a temptation, and it's a temptation which, in a sense, needs to be overcome in the Lord of the Rings. The elves need to learn that their kind of conservative, traditionalist, we may say, outlook on the world history is problematic for different reasons. And if you read the Lord of the Rings, you will remember that one of the key narrative plot of the Lord of the Rings is, of course, the destruction of the One Ring. But the destruction of the One Ring will not just destroy the One Ring, will also destroy everything which is around the One Ring, including the three rings of the elves, which in the sense represent, they are the kind of iconic representation of this both declinist outlook and attempt to prevent change and to create enchanted enclaves of peace. And the power of this ring will fade away, will have to disappear, the Lord of the Rings, and in fact Lorien will be emptied at the end. Lorien will, there will not be Lorien again, and Galadriel, the Queen of Lorien, will have to leave Middle-earth and go back to the west. So certainly, just to go back to your question and sum it up, both within the primary plane and the secondary plane, there is a pessimistic declinist view of history, which goes together with the idea of preservation or embalming, as Tolkien will say, or traditionalist or conservatism. And this position is embraced, is accepted, is focalized though, so it is kind of attached to a particular point of view, a particular outlook, which is partial in a sense. It's not false, it is partial, so it needs to be broadened up, it needs to be integrated with a wider and more precise, more correct outlook on history. And I do think this also reflects Tolkien's primary views as well.
Mm-hmm. I found really interesting what you said about sort of like in the Silmarillion, we have this growing sense of war, right? And this sort of like growing corruption by the characters. Everyone begins in Beleriand, the heaven that we can call of sort of like the world of Tolkien, and everything's really peaceful and they're like in communion with the gods. But then they enter war with Morgoth and the Dark Lords and stuff. But the interesting thing, I think, is see the corruption of the actual elves, right? And how the family of Feanor and all these sort of like families sort of like become kind of evil in their fight against evil. They are, and it's not a direct process. It's not a process of direct contamination with through magic or anything like that. It's just psychologically they go into these like sort of like cycles of revenge that make them go sort of like more evil. And like, so war, there is a clear message, I think, in the Silmarillion, that war, sort of like only by contact with war, you end up being sort of like a little bit contaminated by it. How do we reconcile that with the stark kind of change that we see in the elves of the Third Age, that are suddenly living in these like small spaces, living in sort of like seemingly peace, but also these sort of just like nostalgia that's getting more insignificant?
Thank you very much. Again, I will distinguish between elves and elves. Okay, I don't think that all the elves in the Lord of the Rings are the same. So before, in my answer, I focus mainly on the elves of Lorien, who have indeed this kind of attitude. But we also have the elves of Rivendell, for instance, who instead have a different view. So the elves of Rivendell are much more, in a sense, engaged with the history of Middle-earth. Rivendell is an open space. It's not a closed space. In Lorien, you cannot go. It's an enchanted forest. And whereas in Rivendell is a place where a lot of people are hosted, including dwarves, including hobbits, including men, including a lot of different races. And also, I think we should remember the episode of the Council of Elrond. We see, if you want, this kind of different position debated. And there is in the debate of the Council of Elrond a question about the position of Tom Bombadil. And Tom Bombadil is presented in a letter by Tolkien as a pacifist. I think Tolkien uses the word pacifist only twice in his letters, and one of them is used to refer to the character of Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil is a pacifist in the sense that he does not want to engage in war whatsoever, and he's kind of unaffected by war. He does not want to fight, and in a sense he's even drawn into fighting against his own will. I mean, he doesn't really fight in a very violent way, but it does at a certain point confront the Barrow White, and it's, if you want, it's a bit of confrontation, but again, he's drawn into it against his own will. I mean, he doesn't want to do that, okay? And again, he doesn't want to go outside his borders, and Tolkien in a letter, it contrasts the position of Tom Bombadil as the pacifist with the position of the elves of Rivendell explicitly. And the position of the elves of Rivendell are people who have learned that in a way they need to engage with the history of Middle-earth, okay? And again, they don't do it in waging war as they will do in the Silmarillion, okay? But they still are not completely outside of it, okay? And I think this is a kind of the position of some of the elves. You also have other elves who are the elves of Thranduil, for instance, in Mirkwood, and they do engage in war very much. I mean, they get Hobbit this is one of the army fighting in the Battle of the Five Armies. It's indeed the army of the elves. And the elves of Thranduil, the wood elves, the father of Legolas, are much more belligerent, if you want. Okay, but again, these are the three different outlooks on war, different, but that's again the beauty of Tolkien. I don't think that Tolkien can be reduced only to one thing, not even pacifism in a sense. I mean, because we do have pacifist view, and in a sense it's appreciated, but it's not the only one. It's not, you don't have on the one side pacifism, on the other side warmongering. Okay, there are a lot of different shades that maybe we're going to talk about later on.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, Tom Bombadil is a very interesting example. I think when he appears, he is definitely a pacifist, and you can see how he sort of like relativizes a lot the whole conflict when he sort of like appears. And throughout this whole book, you've been reading about how this is just like a world-ending event, and everyone must act, and everyone must sign up to war to go to fight against Sauron and this like dark threat. But then when he's there, and then like, oh yeah, we destroyed the ring. There, he's like his lack of sort of like worrying about the threat, sort of like points to the fact that like this has happened before, it will happen before, and just sort of like, it warns a little bit about the dangers of like getting too obsessed with things, as Rivendell in a certain sense, and Elrond does. But yeah, really interesting. And we will go now ahead with the second question, which is going to be discussing orcs and the idea of the other, which is something that's been a little bit more popular lately. We have had, if we think about how war looks in Tolkien's world, we have all the ideas that come to us immediately are Sauron, Dark Lord, and especially the orcs, which have gotten into like the popular imaginary. We can even see now in Ukraine, in the Russian-Ukraine war, we can see Ukrainian forces actually calling Russian troops orcs in an effort sort of like to dehumanize them. You can actually see that in the YouTube videos and everything. And obviously, there's this element of the orc as a dehumanized figure has become part of our culture. However, whether that's true or not in Tolkien's world is more up for debate. So how do you think that the idea of the orcs as dark, faceless evil can sort of like reinforce warmongering instincts? And can we even think of them as that in the books?
Thank you very much. That's an interesting question, which in a sense Tolkien himself addressed in a few letters. Okay, so we are lucky because there are some people who had very big problems about the orcs in two different ways. First of all, they had problems because they thought that it's impossible to imagine human beings or creatures in general that are completely corrupt. And there is a letter by W.H. Auden who wrote to Tolkien saying, is it not heretical? I mean, is according to Christian theology, the presence of the orcs? I mean, to think this sort of completely evil creatures. And also the other question was addressed, meaning, is it possible to make this sort of one-to-one comparisons between, say, in the case of Tolkien, orcs and the communist? People say, are the orcs the communist? And Tolkien got very upset and said, no way, I mean, you cannot really do that. But I think to understand a bit more what Tolkien believed, again, we can start from a letter, and it's a letter written during the Second World War to his son Christopher. And Christopher, we don't have the Christopher's original letter, but we can reconstruct what he said. And he would have said something like, I'm here in the middle of orcs, okay? And so I'm surrounded by orcs. I feel like Merry and Pippin in The Lord of the Rings, at the ends of the Uruk-hai. And Tolkien, again, he replied, and in a gentle way, because it was a father writing to a son, and yet he was a bit... he was correcting Christopher. Okay, he was correcting Christopher in two different ways. And I quote, first of all, and I quote because I think it's very important. In real life, the orcs are on all sides, of course. Okay, so it would be a mistake to associate the orcs only with one particular side or with one particular group of people, one particular tribe. That's the word that Tolkien says. I mean, he says it's a fictional device. I mean, because in fiction, in literature, in a sense, we can express different sides of the human being with different characters, but that's not what happens in real life. Indeed, it keeps on saying in real exterior life, men and orcs are on both sides. Okay, so it's a medley, and it's a medley also which is made within the same person, within the same human being. I mean, in a sense, there is an orcish element within ourselves that we need to fight against. Okay, the big fight against the orcs is for Tolkien, first of all, an internal fight. And in fact, in the same letter, Tolkien will urge his son even to go beyond appearances. So even to, you would say, even people that look like, I quote by memory here, but I think it's an orc on a motorbike. Even an orc on a motorbike actually there could behind this orc on a motorbike, there could be a human being they should discover. So even the idea of ugliness as such, okay, is not necessarily a sign of lack of goodness and lack of sanctity even, okay? And so Tolkien addresses this question in these beautiful letters to his son. So I think it would be a very big mistake to associate, as some people do, orcs with the enemy, okay? It's not an external enemy. And the orcs are one dimension of humanity. And again, in another letter, Tolkien is very explicit to explain what kind of dimension that is. And that's the dimension of someone who has been dehumanized. It's the lack of humanity. It's when we lose our humanity, especially we give up our humanity to some different power, to a tyrant. And in fact, going also back to the issue that I mentioned before, the issue of whether orcs are heretical characters, and Tolkien would say in another letter that this is not the case, because in Tolkien's secondary theology, the orcs were not created by evil. So the orcs are corruptions, because evil cannot create anything, and the orcs are essentially, again, the symbol of any humanity, both whether elvish or mannish, corrupted. It's the corruption, the dehumanization of who we are, okay? But it does not really represent an entity, an external entity. And this kind of very strong, making the point, as I was saying before, for instance, that, and the quote, because I find it a funny quote, to ask if the orcs are communists is to me as sensible as asking if communists are orcs. So essentially, completely insensible question. That's not the point. It is a sort of a literary device. It's a literary technique. Just as the elves represent one side of the human psyche. Okay, they are not characters. They don't neatly correspond to anyone on Earth. Okay, we have an elvish side and we have an orcish side. I think, let me say a final thing. I think that much of the reception of the orcs has been heavily influenced by their representation in the movies. Okay, so we need to remember that in many respects, the reception of Tolkien has been mediated, for better or worse, by the movies of Peter Jackson and also by the new series. And these are series which, TV series and the movies are embedding within, let's say, a philosophy or even a theology, which is not the one of Tolkien, okay, which is kind of Hollywood-like American theoretical framework, where black and white are categories to refer to the good and evil, and you have the goodies on one side, the bads on the other side. And it's a bit pity that people think these sort of things about Tolkien, because in Tolkien that's not really the case. You don't have incarnated goodness and incarnated evil, okay, not even the extremes. And any sort of reduction of Tolkien to its Hollywood reception, I think it's a big mistake.
Yes, I completely agree. It is definitely, orcs are definitely a corrupted sort of like, they are corrupted creatures, and I think that it's very clear in the Lord of the Rings, at least in the books, that they are to be pitied for what they have like been through and for all the things that they have been. And there's also a lot of allusions to them coming from men. And you also have men fighting with Sauron that you don't know, but maybe there's sort of like a subtle allusion that they might eventually turn into orcs as well. And so it is interesting how sort of like the orcs still have a lot of personality in the very few scenes in which we see them, and we see them having a moral framework, doing jokes, and sort of like having their own culture that we are kind of like not exposed to see, but by just seeing little snippets of it, Tolkien sort of like says these people also have their own like life. They're not just sort of like this dark wave. So yeah, but I think that there's still the question here of Well, the question of the orcs posed to have the other to our protagonist, to our main story, and by how little they are shown, we see this topic of the other also appearing a lot in classical literature, with sort of like Roman expansionism, with Caesar, especially. We can take the example of the Gallic Wars with Caesar, and how Gauls, barbarians, are used as sort of like an other, as a wild, faceless horde, that can sort of like justify imperialistic endeavors, and sort of like also create an identity of Romanism by differentiation with the others. How do you think that translates to Tolkien and his works?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the ancient depiction of the other, because of course Tolkien was a classicist, and Tolkien had read with Tacitus Germania, for instance. He read the Annales. He was quite familiar, I'm pretty sure, with the sort of problems of the representation of otherness in the ancient world. We do certainly have this sort of thing in the Lord of the Rings. So I do think that we should accept the fact that the orcs in particular represent the other. But as you said rightly so, they are not the only one. Okay, I think it would be a mistake to think that the other is only represented through the orcs. We have, as you said before, I think it's very important, we have the men from the east fighting together with Sauron, and they, as you know, get a much better representation. There is the beautiful scene where Sam looks at the face of a dead man from the east, and he wonders about his family, where he's from, and it reminds me, whenever I read it, this sort of scenes like in the Nothing New on the Western Front, where we have a very similar scene of two enemies, one enemy looking at the other in the same way. Okay, and again, let's remember that Tolkien was fighting the First World War, where even in the years where there was the episodes of fraternity between the different camps. So there's another episode which I think is interesting. It's the episode of when the Roy Rimi fight the Uruk-hai and win, but they also find not just the Uruk-hai, they also find the men that Saruman has recruited, who have said a lot of bad things about the people of Rohan, and when they won the victory, they spare them, they give them back their lives, and they don't kill them. And there's a beautiful dialogue in which the men of Duneland are very, very surprised, because that's not what they expected. And so I think that there are different ways to predicate otherness in Tolkien. And another example is the relationship between dwarves and elves, and maybe we'll come back on this later on, but the friendship between Gimli and Legolas is an example of the overcoming the bias of otherness, because as we know, the elves and dwarves are enemies essentially at the time of the Lord of the Rings. We see it very clearly in The Hobbit, how bitter is the enmity between those two people. So yet in the Lord of the Rings, these two people come together through the friendship of Legolas and Gimli. So yes, the orcs represent an important representation of otherness, but I don't think it's the only one. Okay, there are many other ways to represent otherness, and in most other cases, in a sense, the relationship with the otherness is reconciled, and I think that's also an important theme in the Lord of the Rings.
Yes, very interesting. Very, very beautiful scenes, these ones. And of course, they're not in the movies, so these sort of like little moments might go a long way toward just sort of like changing our perception sometimes of these other sides. Like for these two examples, we also, for instance, in the scene where Sam sees the man from the east, that he's sort of just like shown as like a faceless soldier in the second movie, and then again we also don't see any sort of conclusion with the men that Saruman recruits. So you just sort of like, you don't even see them in battle. So this is just sort of like a thing that gives it a lot less moral, I think, complexity to the whole conflict. Very interesting. And going back to dwarves, I think we might jump on to them, because they're really interesting, and they sort of like, Tolkien's dwarves sort of like represent a bit more of a morally gray area for the good guys, like in a lot of quotes, because they are not as morally sort of like, they don't stand the moral high ground that maybe like elves or like the men of the West sort of like stand on. Now, first, we could remind the viewers, the listeners, that the dwarves are a race that's very much like taken from Norse mythology. We have a lot of influences, like even in the names, in everything. It's very much taken from the Eddas and from the sort of like Finnish and Norse mythology that Tolkien studied. But they are known also for their greed and for their belligerence. They are mostly a race that fights for good and against the dark forces, but they are known for their greed and their belligerence. And so that obviously goes against the tenets of sort of like peace that are like desirable from a society. And even in like the Silmarillion, we find a darker version of the dwarves that starts war constantly with elves and creates sort of like almost like a first crime kind of moment when they steal the jewels from Thingol in Doriath and all that. We also see them being very sort of like struggling struggling with peace in The Hobbit as well a lot. Now, how does Tolkien link belligerence and therefore this lack of peace, both inner and societal, with greed and industrialism? What role do the dwarves play in that?
Thank you. I mean, that's another interesting question. Okay, and again, I think that there's always a temptation to reduce the complexity of Tolkien's characters, because the dwarves, let's say, in a sense, the dwarves are the creation. We should remember it. They are creation of Aule. So Aule is one of the Valar, one of these kind of gods of Middle Earth that were at the beginning of time, and they participated in the creation of the world. And Aule is a very interesting figure in many respects, because Aule is someone who reminds very closely people like Sauron, for instance, or even Morgoth. Aule is the artist, is the artisan. Aule is the one who likes to create, is the one who likes to convert bare matter, like stone, like iron, like gold, into something beautiful. That's really who he is. And I think that with Aule, Tolkien represents the danger, but also the beauty of art. So Aule is a very artistic, crafty character, and the dwarves, in many respects, that's who they are. Okay, these are characters they are the sons of the Aule, and they are characters who like beauty. So they are characters who are in love with beauty, and they like it especially to improve, to make more beautiful what's already beautiful. If you think about Gimli in The Lord of the Rings, Gimli visits the caves of Rohan, and he says, this is amazing, and we need to kind of make them even more beautiful. Okay, so I don't think necessarily the dwarves represent only greed. Okay, so there is something beautiful and nice and good about the dwarves who have to do with the desire, the artistic desire of Aule. And yet this desire can become problematic. So there's a temptation of this desire, which is, as Tolkien says, the temptation of the artist. The temptation of the artist, Tolkien says in a letter, it consists in two different things. First, to be impatient, really was concept of impatience. So in a sense, not to respect the rules of time, and especially the time to develop. A beautiful image, which I think we should always go back to understand Tolkien's idea of art, is the idea of the gardener. The true artist is like a gardener, so with someone who helps the development of a plant. So respect the otherness, the alterity of the plant, and respects the talents, the inner talents, and also the time that the plant needs to develop. Whereas the temptation of the artist is to make things quicker. That's what Tolkien says, and that's what magic does. The magic of Sauron, we know it from another letter, depends on his impatience. He wanted to get things better, quicker. The other temptation is to become the master, the master of their own creation. And then we see this temptation in the dwarves as well. If you think about Thorin Oakenshield in The Hobbit, he wants to have everything on his own. Okay? He does not want to share it with everyone else. The refusal to share is a very important temptation of the dwarves, as it was already a temptation of Aule, and also as it is a temptation of Morgoth and a temptation of Sauron. So here with the dwarves, I do think that we go to the core of Tolkien's vision of art. Art is a beautiful thing, but can be dangerous. There is a risky thing to do, because this can turn into greed, and greed is, in a sense, the result of when one yields to that temptation of the artist, when one does not want to share with any other people, or when it doesn't want to respect the otherness of the creation, and therefore also not respecting the time needed for the creation to develop. So coming back to the Lord of the Rings, and when we see dwarves, I mean, dwarves have a role to play as well. Okay, so dwarves are not necessarily evil characters. So I don't think the dwarves need to change. It's not like dwarves need to go against their own nature. Their own nature is beautiful. There is something good about them, but they need to risk to fight against the temptation of being on their own. So I think that's going back to the issue of belligerence and war. War becomes problematic where it goes against the rules, against what is asked. When it, in a sense, it's an expression of one's own individuality, one's own impatience, one's own temptation of domination on nature and on other things. But even the dwarves, like Gimli, needs to fight because Gimli is a warrior, okay? But he does fight in the battle, in a way, fulfilling the role as it is being given to him. So sorry for this kind of, maybe it was a complex answer, okay? But again, the dwarves are not bad characters, okay? They have a temptation they need to overcome, and when they do that, they will be able to, in a sense, purify that beautiful desire for art, because that's who they are, and they will be able to purify also their temptation of greed, because the greed is also, of course, the temptation of the dwarves. Going back to the rings, and let me conclude with that. Let's remember that there is the one ring, and then there are a lot of other rings given to each different race, and each ring, in a sense, multiplies, enhances the temptation of the particular race. So the rings of the elves multiply the temptation of the embalming and conservatorism, whereas the rings of the dwarfs, as we know it, multiply greed, the desire to hoard things, to kind of hoard things and control them and not sharing them.
Yes, really interesting. But maybe we're going to go to the fourth question. And we're finally going to talk about men. So if we've seen like what the role of the elves is, the orcs, where the belligerence of the dwarves stems from. We've seen it's like the arts and their desire for art that can be too impatient sometimes. And then now we're going to the men of the West, right? So the good men, in like also quotes, who at the same time are very belligerent and are sort of like their society is centered a little bit on war. We have Rohan, we have sort of like more nomadic warriors, but that are still sort of like their society is based on an honor code, where war is very much in the center of it. And with Gondor, we also have a society that's a little bit more paranoid, based on defense, the first line of defense, but then also again all geared very much toward war. So they're very inspired. The Reldos men are heavily inspired by all the English poetry, Anglo-Saxon culture, and we see that in a lot of the poems that like have similarities to Anglo-Saxon poems, war is glorified almost. We have the scene, obviously, of Tolkien, of Theoden riding into battle in the Pelennor field. So like they sing while they're slaying orcs because they're so happy that there's like in the glory of war. And then these feelings, I think, are also exacerbated in the movies even more. And these quotes, like the quotes that they sing in battle and stuff, have almost become like so quotable that's what the takeaway that you get. I think that it would be interesting now to consider the adaptations, the movies, for a little bit, because they're just such a big part of the perception that a lot of people now have, the way that they have arrived to these stories. And how do you think that militarization and sort of like the glorification of war is portrayed in the movies versus in the books, especially with men?
Yeah, I mean, I have personally a very negative judgment in the way war is portrayed in the movies, okay? And I think I'm pretty sure that Tolkien would have shared my view, because we have some comments that he makes in the letters that, for instance, I am very upset with the first script that was written for one possible adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, and he said, why has this guy taken away all the description natural places, which are so important, especially if you want to read The Lord of the Rings. In fact, the scenes of war are a very tiny minority, okay, compared to journeying in the countryside, in the mountains, and so on. We do, however, of course, very important scenes of war, the Battle of the Fields of Pelennor, the Battle at Elms, but these are really very few in a way. And we should also remember that quite often Tolkien likes to omit description of war. So if you think about The Hobbit, for instance, the Battle of the Five Armies, it's not told. Okay, Bilbo loses conscience and then he reawakes. That's all done. Okay, this is something we should not be forgotten. And the fact that, especially The Hobbit, the fact that is instead the Battle of Five Armies plays such a big part in the movie is so against what's happening in The Hobbit. It's not just
the whole movie.
Just the against the whole idea of The Hobbit, which is a story told from the point of view of a hobbit who is not interested in war, is not fighting, and therefore the tale of the war is like takes like 1.5 pages in Tolkien, in Gandalf's report, and is very quickly dismissed. And the same, if you think about it, the same is in The Lord of the Rings, because we have a kind of parallel scene when Pippin loses conscience at the battle in front of the gate of the Morano, and that's it. And then we have again a very quick report later on, but we don't have all the details, okay? And these omissions, I think, are so important to understand Tolkien's outlook on war, okay? And the movies, in a sense, have completely destroyed that. And I mean, the movies have done a lot of good things in some respects, but I think they have missed some important things, and certainly the representation of war is one of them. And also what I think they have missed, which made me very upset, is the distinction between characters like Boromir and Faramir, which is a very important contrast that we have in The Lord of the Rings. The position of Faramir, there is a beautiful quote of Faramir, which I'm going to read now very briefly, because I think he says very clearly what's the position of the good Númenórean, okay? And since, as Tolkien himself said, Faramir was the character closest to him, not him, but closest to him, I think he also, in my view, represents what Tolkien believed about war. And the quote, I mean, it's very famous, but I think it's very beautiful. And Faramir says, "For myself, I will see the white tree," it is to say, the symbol of Gondor's power, in flower again in the courts of the kings, and the silver crown return, and Minas Tirith in peace. So peace is the desire of Faramir. War must be. I want Minas Tirith in peace. War must be. Why we defend our lives against a destroyer who will devour all. Okay, so Faramir is not a pacifist like Tom Bombadil. I personally think that also Tolkien himself was not completely a pacifist. Okay, I'm not saying that he was not only a pacifist. Let's say I think he had a pacifist strand, but he was not just a pacifist. But as I said, just reading, Faramir says, "War must be while we defend our lives against a destroyer who will devour us all. But I do not love the bright sword for his sharpness, nor the arrow for his swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory." And not the warrior of his glory is almost an allusion to Boromir, who instead likes and loves his glory, and therefore likes war because of his own glory. "I love only that which they defend, the city of the Mayor of Númenor, and I will ever love for a memory, ancientry, and beauty, and a present wisdom," and so on. So Faramir's position is like, I don't like war, I want peace. Sometimes war is unavoidable, okay, but it should not be loved, okay. Whereas you do have other men who have a bit of a different outlook. The people of Rohan certainly have a different outlook for Faramir, and that instead they are not Númenóreans, okay, they are a kind of different people. And also Boromir himself has a different outlook on war. And as we know, Boromir is kind of no longer a full Númenórean, okay? He's kind of losing a bit his Númenórean identity, and he's becoming a bit more similar like Rohan, and that's something that it's said explicitly. So I do think that Tolkien's position is closer to the one of Faramir, but again, does not coincide with the one of Faramir, because we also I would like to stress that, because especially nowadays, what I'm going to say now seems maybe a bit unfashionable, okay? But Tolkien was, for instance, a great opposer of the use of nuclear power in the Second World War, and this is something which again was not so common, okay, at that time, okay, because the rhetoric of the use of the nuclear bomb was quite popular, and for the people who have seen recently the movie of Oppenheimer, okay, yes. exactly in Oppenheimer's movie, there is not exactly a full condemnation of the use of war, and not even a full condemnation of the development of the technology that will lead. Tolkien has instead very strong wars against this kind of use, and even explicitly mentions the character of Saruman as the kind of a good representation of the use of nuclear war. Even in war, there are different ways of wage war. Okay, I don't think for Tolkien, war can be conducted in only one way. And we may say there is, I wouldn't say a justified war, because that will lead us a bit astray. But I think there are human way of waging war, and not human way of waging war. It's certainly the way of Saruman is not the human way, and so I do think that in a sense. I personally believe, that's my belief, so I'm not certain about it, but I personally believe that in the context where we are now, Tolkien will be much more pacifist than he was during the first half of the second century. But we are not in a very different context. Okay, we are in a context now where we can blow up the whole world, in a sense. So I think that we should be much more wary. But going back to your question again, just as in the case of elves, there are men and men in Tolkien's universe. Okay, I think there are different shades of manhood, and which I think we should appreciate that. And I'm pretty sure that the one that, in a sense, represents more the view of Tolkien at that age, in his own particular context, is the one of Faramir. Someone who believes that war is needed only as a way to defend, not to attack, and it should be loathed in a sense, not loved for its own sake.
Yeah, I mean, I just find just so interesting that you mentioned sort of like the sort of like Tolkien's views on nuclear war, and that which I also very much agree with. But in sort of like when talking about Boromir and Faramir, because the ring, in a certain sense, can have a lot of like allusions to that, right? So like this weapon of unspeakable power that ultimately, like you don't know where it's going to end up. And Boromir says we should use it. Boromir wants to use it for good. He's convinced that it's going to be sort of like a Denethor as well. It's going to be just like sort of like a weapon that even the good guys have it. But Faramir, in the end, sort of like overcomes this temptation and just also says that it's just like not a power that anyone should have. I think that the metaphors with sort of like nuclear warfare is pretty like sort of like on view here.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, the ring, of course, is an important instrument of war. Okay, it's an important, and if you think about it, in the Lord of the Rings, the only reason why war is accepted is either as a defense, the defense of Minas Tirith, the defense of Rohan, or as a distraction. Because when they go to Mordor, this is sort of the whole point of that is not really to win the victory because it is impossible. Okay, but just to distract.
Yes.
So
yes.
I think that the real war, the real mission of the Lord of the Rings, of course, is the destruction of the ring, which is in a way an instrument of war. Or better, it's an instrument of war conceived as the destruction and the control of other beings. Okay, that's what the ring does. The ring is power. If you think about the power of the ring, is the power to control other people, is to control. Whereas that's not the power that even Gandalf exerts. I was reading recently the dialogue between Saruman and Gandalf in front of the Tower of Orthanc. And it's beautiful because, I mean, Gandalf says, I'm prepared to let you go wherever you want. Okay, so I don't want you to, if you're ready to give up your power, the power of your the power of Saruman, then you can go wherever you want. You can even go to Sauron. Gandalf accepts to the extreme the freedom of other people. Okay, Gandalf does not restrict the freedom of other people. And you see how, again, war in Tolkien's Middle Earth should be considered in different ways, because war is only acceptable as a defense, not as a way to control other people. To control other people, it's what the ring does. And of course, the whole point, as you said, of the Lord of the Rings is to give up power. And I think if you think about, again, the episode of Faramir, which I think is so interesting, because Faramir is at a certain point put in the same situation of Boromir. So, or better, Boromir is given the chance to do what Boromir tried to do, because Faramir has the possibility to take the ring for himself, and not even for his own self, but to give it to his father as his father wants. So which is exactly what Boromir tries to do in the two scenes are clear in parallel there. So the kind of the dialogue between Boromir and Frodo at the end of the second book, and the dialogue between Faramir and Frodo are really in parallel. And if you read them again, you can see how they are in parallelism. And it's interesting that Faramir went decide eventually to give up power and even to go against the laws of his own country because he's doing something illegal. And so on. He's doing it with the awareness of Boromir's temptation, because he at a certain point he sighs and says, yeah, and this poor Boromir, he says, poor Boromir, because the trial was too difficult and so on.
Yes.
And it's interesting how in that moment there is an exegesis of Boromir's event, but again with a lot of pity, because that's the thing, it's very Tolkienian. Tolkien has a lot of pity for everyone, okay?
Yes.
Tolkien condemns, but the condemnation always goes together with pity. And Boromir is a pitiful character, okay? Even at his very worst, okay? And I think this is something always to remember when we read Tolkien.
When you talk about Saruman and sort of like this new unjust war, it's you're referring to in the Two Towers. This is maybe like not familiar to people that might only be exposed to the movies, but Saruman uses new kinds of warfare. He uses sort of like maybe some sort of genetic warfare to like mutate the orcs. He uses weather sort of like magic in order to explosions, new sort of like chemicals, right? So there's like new kinds of like nastier warfare a little bit used in this fight in the book. How do you think that relates to like Saruman's influences, or just like sort of like metaphorical presence as like industrialism and modernity?
Certainly so. I mean, certainly industrialism is correct. Modernity, I will speak more specifically of the machine, okay? That's the talking concept, okay? Technology is a negative sense. I personally don't think that Tolkien should be presented as an anti-modern character or someone who is against industrialization as such. Okay, I think this is it's a bit of a caricature. Okay, you know that there's been a new edition of the letter released just a couple of weeks ago. There is a letter where it talks about the industrialization of Oxford. Okay, and I think it's an interesting letter because it starts saying, they have converted Oxford into a sort of a car factory, it's a disaster, and so on. But then in the second half of the sentence, say, of course, I don't say that change is necessarily worse, because before these changes, there were slums in Oxford where people were dying, and there was a disaster. Okay, so even in a letter which kind of he condemns in the industrialization of Oxford, okay, he still has positive words against some aspects of it, which is in a way made possible to convert Cowley, I think is referring to, so kind of a poor quarter of Oxford, in the east of Oxford, into a more decent place to live. Okay, so I think we need to avoid caricaturing Tolkien as a sort of this anti-industrial man. Okay, what he certainly was against was the idea of a machine, and the machine, especially as a weapon of war. That's really what he disliked so much. But again, we need to go back to his own biography to understand that, okay, because that was the First World War was about, and the First World War was essentially the first modern war, and maybe the only one, okay, because the Second World War was a bit different, and a lot of weapons that had been used in the First World War were not used in the Second World War, like a lot of chemical weapons were banned after the First World War, whereas the First World War was really almost like a huge laboratory for modern warfare, okay? That's something that really Tolkien could really not accept, okay? So, and I do agree very much that Saruman's experiments in Isengard are clearly evoking some of the experiments that were made in the First World War. Then we also should also think about what Saruman does to the Shire, okay? So, of course, when Saruman goes to the Shire, he converts the Shire into an industrialized place, recalling Birmingham, I mean, in many respects. They say that the Shire at the end of the story is the Birmingham where Tolkien lived in. So I'm not saying that Tolkien was in favor of industrialization and in favor of the kind of the ugliness of the factories of Birmingham. Okay, I just kind of want to resist an over caricaturing of this. Okay, so it was not necessarily anti-technology as such. We know that, for instance, he loved driving cars. I mean, we know that actually that's something they enjoy very much. He's someone that tried new technology, like recording technology. That's something that he enjoyed. So I think we need to have he was a kind of a clever, normal person, okay? He was not the kind of person who refused to use technology completely. And he also said, which always struck me, one of the great blessings of his life was to have been given once a type machine, okay, to type his own books and say, thanks God, this saved my life, okay, and they would never be able to finish the Lord of the Rings without it, okay. So we need to be a bit kind of careful with that. But certainly there is a kind of, again, the excesses of industrialization and especially the excesses of technology developed for the destruction of human beings that certainly was really against, and that's in a sense what we see in the character of Saruman.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very, very interesting. It's also interesting how the scouring of the Shire is the last thing that we see of this world. Lord of the Rings is the latest, sort of like the latest books that we have in terms of like in-world chronology, and we just see this like pastoral, perfect world that's sort of like been corrupted. There's like been this, but like industrialization has sort of like got to it. Even if the general message of the end is positive, we still have these like things in the end. Having discussed all that, and obviously we've sort of like kind of gotten already to the point of this issue, which is discussing the role of peace and the perception of peace that readers can extract from Tolkien's works and from the Lord of the Rings. I think especially fitting is what we were talking in the end about how war used as a distraction, used as something sort of like as a defense mechanism, but the war for the ring is won with just the sort of like the two hobbits walking in and destroying a weapon of warfare. So it's not won through war, and this message is extremely clear. That just brute force is just sort of like not gonna achieve anything, and it's always a very sort of like futile agent in the Lord of the Rings. So thinking about all that, and what kinds of conflict resolution do you think that the Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, etc., promotes?
That's a very difficult question. Okay, so
Yes.
I will address the question two different ways. Okay, so first, how we get there and what do we want to have? Okay, we start with the second. What do we want to have? I mean, what's the result of peace? How does Tolkien conceive peace? Okay, because I think this is an important question. In one letter, again, Tolkien says, I mean, there is war also in peace. I mean, a sort of a peace. Peace is not just the absence of war. Okay, you can have peace, but with internal warfare in society. Okay, that's not really peace. I mean, it's just a very problematic perception of peace. It's just the appearance of peace. So I think it's important to understand how Tolkien conceived peace. And if you think about the ending of the Lord of the Rings, which of course is peace, because at the end the Lord of the Rings ends up with peace. That's the goal, and that's the plot goal of the Lord of the Rings. It's a moment of peace, and peace involves this sort of community where you have different people, okay, whose difference is respected, okay, because in a sense there is the Shire where the hobbits live, there is the wood where the elves live, so the kind of the differences of the different society are respected. So the kind of peaceful society that Tolkien has in mind is not the sort of capitalistic, consumeristic, globalized society where everyone is the same. And we know that also because it talks about it in a letter written in during the Second War. It says, I'm very afraid not just of communism in the East, but also I'm very afraid of American capitalism, capitalistic society in the West. Okay, we know that. And I think that it's important to remember that in Legend of the Rings, we don't have everyone becoming the same. Okay, so it's not like a peace meaning homogeneous integration of everyone. Okay, we have the differences respected. At the same time, these differences are not in a sense individualistic. It's not like each one do mind their own business and that's it. It's a kind of a society of peace where people are talking to each other, are collaborating with each other, and they are part of a whole. If you think about the Shire, Tolkien says in a letter, is not an idealized place. Okay, the Shire, as we encounter it at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, it's not the perfect place, because it's the place of people who have lost the understanding of the outside world, who think to be an island where they don't need to care about people outside. And this is a mistake. I mean, the hobbits are not idealized characters, and the Shire is not an idealized place. And at the end of the Lord of the Rings, this, if you want, is the true peace that the Shire the Shire is not really in peace at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings. There is also internal fighting within
Yes.
okay, there are families fighting with each other. It's not a really peaceful place, the Shire. Okay,
Yes.
Again, the Lord of the Rings movies, I mean, gave this sort of a Shire perception, so that everything is fine. It's not exactly like that. Okay, there are some problems that need to be solved, and they need to be solved at the end. And that's the true peace of the king, when the Shire becomes a kind of a province within a bigger world.
Yes.
How do we achieve that? So going back to how do we achieve peace? That's really if we want the whole message of the Lord of the Rings. So we achieve peace when we stop trying to control other people. That's really when we stop. When we decide not to fight evil with evil. Okay, because that's really what is I would say the message. Because Tolkien would have hated the word. Okay, but one of the things that happen in the Lord of the Rings is certainly that you don't fight evil against evil. So you don't become. If you want to fight the evil of the world, the true attitude is not to try to use evil against it. Okay, you need to resist evil. You need to kind of preserve your humanity, not to accept becoming an orc, so not to losing your humanity in order to fight evil. And that's, I think, it's the way of Tolkien. Okay, the way of peace is that's the way of peace, essentially, not to fight for our humanity, to fight for, and I think just like Tolkien. It's interesting that when Tolkien was talking about the aftermath of the Second World War, he's saying that things are not going exactly as in my book. The kind of peace after the Second World War was not the peace of the Lord of the Rings, and he said it. I mean, this is the peace of Saruman we have. Okay, we have a lot of Saruman trying to do. That's not the peace, and he said we've seen that a lot of problems that resulted from the peace of the Second World War. For instance, something was really striking me a lot when I read it. Again, very problematic if you think about it nowadays, especially considered the standard narrative of the Second World War. Tolkien had very harsh words against the destruction of Germany, for instance. Whereas, again, wherever we watch a movie nowadays, we take for granted that the siege of the destruction of Berlin justified the killing of hundreds of thousands of Germans on the way. Okay, that's something which no one questions. But whereas Tolkien questioned that, okay, the idea of punishing Germany, the idea of violent, murdering, raping a lot of people as a revenge. I mean, that's not what Tolkien would have liked, okay. Again, I don't want to enter into contemporary politics, okay, because that would be a bit dangerous, okay. But clearly, the way of Tolkien is not sheer revenge against everyone, okay. That's not the way of Tolkien. Certainly not, even if one wants to talk about just war in Tolkien's view, which again I don't want to do that because I think it would be problematic, but that's not certainly the sense that it's normally given to the world, especially in 2023.
Amazing.
Don't say as a way of punishing evil.
But in this ending that we sort of like see where you see this connected world, we have all these provinces now, Aragorn, so like as a peaceful ruler, but we also see that this world has no place for the elves anymore, and they see it and they leave. And I wonder, I was just wondering what sort of like what we could make in terms of peace, for like it not having place for this so like more ancient cultures.
Thank you, because it's interesting to understand the question. So it's interesting that Tolkien uses the word peace many times in reference to the journey of the elves to the west.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason why the elves leave Middle-earth is to seek for peace. So the object is peace. Why the peace of the elves is only possible in Valinor, so on the other side of the ocean? Okay, again, here I don't think there is a one answer. Okay, so I gave you my answer, but I'm open to be, in a sense, corrected. The way I understand the elves is the elves, in my view, represent a temptation of the human being. Okay, the sort of aestheticist, nostalgic temptation of human beings of being attached to one particular moment of one's life. Okay, mm-hmm. So that if in one's life there is one particular moment, one particular, we can be youth, we can be where everything is perfect. Okay. And the temptation of the elves is the sort of clinging to that moment, to that page. And to use an analogy that Tolkien himself uses, to cling on one page in a book. So there is a book to read, and then it's like you're obsessed with one particular page and you don't want to go on. I think that's the temptation of the elves. But as a human, and I do have this temptation, okay, to think that my life, in a sense, was
fulfilled in one moment of it. Okay, so when I was 22, that was the moment, and I will never be able to get back to that particular. And this can refer to the life of a human being or to the life and the history of a civilization. Okay, if you think about Western civilization, for instance, okay, or to the history of literature. What if you think about Western literature? Is there a moment in time where the Western literature, what is best, should we recover? And that's a temptation that Tolkien certainly had. Okay, and Tolkien certainly had a fascination with the elves since the young age. But what Tolkien is suggesting, I think, is that this is impossible in this world. So it is impossible in this world to stay on a single page of the book. Okay, it is not what God wants us to be. Okay, that's what Tolkien used the word God, because Tolkien will use the word God. So in a sense, the true peace, the true fulfillment of this desire for perfection, for timelessness, cannot be fulfilled in this world. So will never be fulfilled in this world. So we need to accept that this desire will be fulfilled in another world. And that's why I think the elves need to go on the Western side. It's not that human beings need to die, okay? We need to go on the other side. But I think in Tolkien's Christian vision, of course, complete fulfillment is impossible in this world. Which does not mean that we need just to do anything. There's not a fatalistic attitude to it, okay? In the sense of, okay, fine, so life is very bad to live, the world is a disaster, we should do nothing, and that's it. Because that's all we have, okay? We have Aragorn coming back at the end. We have a return of the king. This is very important. In Tolkien's view, we need to engage with history. We need to do our best. We need to improve things, but ready to let it go. Okay, and I think at the end of the story, Aragorn lets it go and dies. Okay, and I think this is very important. So nothing can be preserved forever. Everything is transient, and I think this acceptance of transience relates to the journey of the way of the elves to the west. So the inner peace, to go back to your question, the inner peace that Tolkien talks about is fully possible only on the other side of the ocean.
Yes.
Okay? And accepting that is what gives peace already in this world. So accepting that to a certain extent nothing can fulfill our needs in this world, then it's the beginning of peace. And if we have that kind of attitude, then paradoxically we can live well also in this world. So to have a sort of detached attitude towards primary reality, towards reality as it is also the beginning of peace in this world. It's also, that's, if you want, I think Aragorn represents very well. Aragorn is a fantastic, peaceful ruler, but he's also a ruler who knows that he does not own his kingdom and therefore is ready to leave. He does not own his own life, and so he's ready to give it up to someone else. And this kind of it's a paradoxical attitude towards reality, okay, is also, I think, the foundation of peace. Being engaged with the world, but without being entrapped with it, without feeling dominated by it. In the world, but not of this world, to quote Augustine.
All right. I think that's. I really agree with that. I think that Aragorn sort of like really encompasses this final sort of like message of Tolkien that he gives you as sort of like the ultimate idea of just like a gentle sort of like organization of society. It's more understanding. Yes. So I think that we're gonna end it here. Thank you so much for this, I think, very insightful discussion on the actual original themes and messages of the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, the Silmarillion, that really sort of like paints like sort of like a very beautiful picture of just sort of like all these messages that I think are especially relevant in today's society, that continue to be very relevant, and that to unearth their true intentions and meanings, with how much sometimes they've been like polluted and sort of like twisted, is I think especially important. So thank you very much. That was really insightful. And
thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's always beautiful to talk about Tolkien, because like we discover something when we do it. I mean, it's always a heuristic process when we're talking about Tolkien.
I have certainly discovered so many new things about a text that you always think that you sort of like know, and then it just surprises you again. So yes, thank you very much, Dr. Pezzini.
Thank you very much, Albert. Thank you very much.
Do keep an eye out for more episodes as we continue to explore the role that storytelling in different media shapes how we understand, imagine, depict, and approach peace. If you'd like to support our podcast, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening to it from and leave a review. If you'd like to join our conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualizing Peace or email us directly at vispeace@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. Our guest today was Dr. Giuseppe Pezzini. Thank you for listening.